Welcome to the deep dive. Today, our source material is taking us right into, a real conflict zone in the modern world.
It definitely is. We're looking at that intersection where deeply held religious identities clash with, shifting social norms and moral judgments.
And not just social norms, but the state's role in all of this, its desire to regulate what people do in their private lives. It's a heavy mission for a deep dive, but a really necessary one.
Absolutely. We have this stack of articles, ethnographic research, even psychological studies, and they all explore how these moral lines get drawn.
Right, from the smallest, most personal transgression, all the way up to, this is where it gets dark, state-sanctioned persecution.
And the question we're chasing is, what are the psychological concepts, and maybe even the theological ones, that underpin these judgments?
And right away, we're moving past that really rigid black and white view of religious practice you so often see. Our sources introduce this concept. It's a scholarly term, impiety.
Exactly. It's this idea that religious life isn't just about simple obedience to divine commands that are somehow frozen in time.
Because that binary view, it just doesn't capture how people actually live their lives.
It doesn't. And impiety signals that piety is, well, it's a dynamic, negotiated space. It exists in the real world, not just in a textbook.
So let's unpack that term a little, impiety. Is this just a fancy word for hypocrisy, or is there something deeper going on?
That's the key distinction. It's not about hypocrisy because it acknowledges that someone's religious consciousness, it doesn't just switch off when they break a rule.
I see it.
Instead, it suggests that pious nuances can exist even in practices that seem to completely contradict mainstream standards. The religious commitment is still there, even if the daily practice isn't always perfect.
That feels vital, because if you only see piety as this rigid all-or-nothing thing, you immediately fall into these false binaries. It's either secular modernity over here or piety and morality over there.
And that untangles religion from everyday life. It suggests that, if you drink a glass of wine, you've somehow exited this moral universe entirely.
Which isn't how it works.
Not at all. As the sources really emphasize, Islam is woven into the whole spectrum of life. The sacred and the profane, the significant and the mundane. It's always present.
And this is where the material gets so interesting, because it gives real-world examples of this exact thing in Muslim-majority countries. Like an Iranian woman who is, diligent about her daily prayers, a core act of piety, but she also goes to mixed-gender parties.
Or you see Turkish Muslims celebrating the end of Ramadan, a month of intense devotion, by consuming alcohol. There are also examples of Jakartan families attending Friday prayers and then immediately going out for what the sources call hedonic shopping.
So the lawful, the halal, and the unlawful, the haram, they're not in separate boxes. They're just juxtaposed in daily life.
Exactly.
Now, I can hear a listener thinking, okay, but isn't that just people doing what they want and using religion as a cover? But the argument is more nuanced than that.
It is. The scholars actually classify these as regulated transgressions.
So regulated transgressions.
Yeah. They're not seen as a sign of utter disregard for religion. The sources suggest they might actually be part of a kind of ethical self-cultivation.
Hold on, ethical self-cultivation. That's a huge claim. How can breaking a rule be a form of cultivation?
Well, the cultivation happens in how the person frames the sin. It's about managing the guilt. They aren't denying it's a sin.
So what are they doing?
They're managing the consequence. And they do that by strategically focusing on certain attributes of God. This makes the relationship a deeply personal one, sort of bypassing societal judgment.
So it's not denial, it's selection. They're focusing on God as, say, Al-Ghafur, the most forgiving, or Al-Rahim, the most merciful.
Precisely. They're leaning on those reassuring attributes.
But doesn't that come with a huge theological risk? I mean, if you only focus on mercy, aren't you diminishing God's justice, his foreboding attributes?
The balance is razor thin. And that's the regulated part. They're not trying to erase God as Al-Muntakim, the Avenger, or Al-Hasib, the Reckoner. They are. Well, they're hoping that God's benevolence and patience will give them time to repent and avoid divine wrath.
It's like a calculated spiritual maneuver.
It is. It's a way to keep from completely breaking from your faith just because you're not perfect. It's a survival mechanism.
Okay, so we've established this really complex personal space of regulated transgression where guilt is managed through hope, but now we have to pivot. We have to move to a different kind of transgression, one that society and the state views as completely intolerable. We're leaving behind the manageable sins and going into areas of high social and legal risk.
We're talking about non-traditional sexual identity and gender roles.
Exactly. This is where the transgression stops being a private matter between an individual and God.
and becomes a perceived threat to the whole collective identity. In Arab identity, for example, everything is so heavily defined by social values, by honor and shame, or aib.
And within that framework, the sources are clear. Non-traditional sexual identities are seen as completely unacceptable. It leads to people being mistreated, discarded.
And that burden of protecting the family's honor, it almost always falls harder on women. They become the symbols of the family's reputation.
So any nonconformity is seen as a stain on the entire family line.
A source of aib, yes.
We saw an anecdote in the sources that it perfectly illustrates this pressure. It was on a marriage forum.
Oh, right, the story about closeted Muslim men marrying women to satisfy their families, or maybe hoping it will, cure them.
It's just a tragic outcome of that intolerance. In this specific case, the prospective wife was noticing her fiancé was distant, but the real confirmation came when he sent her a photo.
And it had a Grindr watermark on it.
A Grindr watermark. And beyond just the emotional heartbreak, the source uses this to highlight the very real practical health risks. The woman was suddenly worried about contracting hepatitis B. That's the reality when conformity is forced.
And this pressure, it extends to reinforcing traditional gender roles, too. There was a study of young Bedouin Arab men that found something really specific.
What was that?
It was about the men who held both a strong, traditional masculine identity and favorable views towards polygyny. They were actually the most vulnerable to feeling like their ego was threatened if a wife refused a polygynous arrangement.
So the man who most believes in his right to a second wife is the one who feels most personally attacked if the first wife says no.
Exactly. Her nonconformity, even within marriage, is seen as a direct assault on his status. It just reinforces those patriarchal expectations through shame.
Which sets a really chilling stage for what comes next. What happens when the state steps in and turns that collective shame into actual codified violence?
Now we're moving to state enforcement. Egypt is the key example here, where the government presents itself as the guardian of the moral order.
Right. And to do this, they rely on these intentionally vague laws. There's no law that explicitly says homosexuality is illegal.
No, instead they use these sweeping morality provisions. There's the combating of prostitution law, which is from 1961, and the much more recent anti-cybercrimes law from 2018.
And these laws get weaponized. People are prosecuted for these broad catch-all charges like debauchery or undermining public morals. So how does the state even find these individuals?
The tactics are, well, they're chilling. Police officers create fake profiles on dating apps like Grindr.
To entrap people.
Yes. They initiate conversations, they elicit confessions, and the evidence used in court is often just from illegal searches of their phones, screenshots of private chats, photos, even just having the app installed is used against them.
And once someone's detained, due process just goes out the window.
Completely. People are denied lawyers, they're pressured into signing forced confessions.
And the abuses in detention.
They're horrifying. They amount to institutionalized torture. The reports document severe beatings, sexual assault, and forced anal exams.
Which, as the sources make very clear, are medically discredited and have zero scientific validity. They are internationally recognized as a form of torture.
And in a final act of cruelty, transgender women are often held in men's cells where they face constant sexual assault and harassment.
It's a stunning level of hypocrisy. The self-proclaimed guardian of morality becomes the perpetrator of sexual violence. It really forces you to ask, how do the individuals doing this rationalize it?
It can't just be following orders.
No, you have to look at the psychology of the enforcer.
Which is why that study on Egyptian male harassers is so important. It analyzed interviews with men who openly admitted to harassment.
And what were their justifications?
Some of them argued that sexual harassment was essentially a punishment by God.
A punishment?
Yes. For women who failed to follow what they saw as religious rules, like staying home to serve their families, the violence was reframed as a righteous act.
So they weren't just justifying their actions, they were actively blaming the victims for even being in public.
Exactly. They said that women deserve what they get in the streets if they leave home without a chaperone or they compete with men for jobs. It shows how these judgmental beliefs are used to fuel violence.
This brings us full circle, connecting this specific local enforcement of morality back to these universal psychological principles. We're moving into the psychology of moral identity and prejudice.
And this is where it gets really counterintuitive. The research suggests that for people with a very strong moral identity, People who see morality as absolutely central to who they are, a sense of moral superiority, can actually lead to more prejudice.
Wait, say that again. That really flips things on their head. You're saying the stronger someone feels their own moral goodness, the more likely they are to be prejudiced against an outgroup.
That's the core finding. The very act of feeling morally good can act as a license to discriminate.
A license. Wow.
It's a form of what's called moral self-enhancement. And the research shows this impulse is strongest in the moral domain, even more than feeling smarter or more popular. And crucially, this self-enhancement is largely irrational.
So this internal feeling of we are the good ones becomes the engine. And that engine needs a target. If an outgroup is seen as threatening that pristine moral self-image, the in-group feels justified in attacking them.
It turns morality into a weapon of self-defense.
Mm.
And this sense of superiority is in such stark contrast to the theological guidance in the source material itself.
How so?
Well, Quranic exegesis warns explicitly against hitting the threshold of arrogance. It references a specific verse, QS Luqman 18.
And what's the guidance there?
It's all about balance. It says, you should cultivate self-confidence and spiritual awareness, but you must remain humble and avoid pride. The moment that moral striving turns into an illusion of moral superiority, it becomes destructive.
So if we synthesize this entire deep dive, we've gone from the subtle, regulated transgressions of an individual hoping for God's mercy all the way to these devastating consequences when society decides nonconformity is an intolerable deviance.
And we saw how this moral enforcement is intensely gendered, how it's weaponized by the state, and how it's all justified by the psychological comfort that comes from feeling morally superior.
The illusion of moral perfection becomes the engine for persecution.
Yes. It really is a powerful reminder that when religion gets tangled up with this drive for moral superiority, it stops being about how you live and starts being about how you judge and punish others.
Which leads to this deep systemic hypocrisy where the moral guardian is also the one committing these severe human rights abuses.
The insight is so complex. The individual believer finds a way to regulate sin and maintain their spiritual connection, but the societal enforcers, they lack that same mechanism. They just use morality as a tool for dominance.
We've seen that a strong sense of moral superiority can dangerously license prejudice against perceived outgroups. So what does it mean for a society when the very mechanisms used to enforce its moral vision, whether it's vague legal codes or forced confessions or just collective shame, are fueled by this dangerous, irrational illusion of moral perfection?
That's the question, isn't it?
It seems to be the key to understanding why regulated transgression is personally manageable, but regulated persecution becomes an unstoppable force, something for all of us to think about.